Good morning, everybody. My name is John Becknell, and I'm working with the North Dakota EMS Association and the Mental Health Committee on these videos. Thank you for joining us this morning. With me today are Marcy Dawson from Sanford and Kyle Michaels and Lynn Hartman. And we're here today to talk about, our topic was, it's the everyday EMS challenges that wear us out, not the big stuff. And we know that that's true. We know that many of us find ourselves frustrated over the small stuff that happens to us in EMS, and often it's the operational things, short staffing, middle of the night transfers, all of that stuff that gets at us. But sometimes it is the big stuff. So Lynn, you kind of have a different take on maybe what we should talk about today. So just set this up for us.
Well, our first responder families across the state are grieving right now, some terrible losses, and sometimes these, well, and we want the friends, families, colleagues of people who are grieving now to know that we grieve with them, and that sometimes these gut punches that we get are things that we really need to have awareness of and visit about. And so I'm just wondering if maybe that's part of what our conversation today could be.
Yes, of course. And we are often at a loss for words when we are experiencing losses within the first responder family. And I just thought all of us on this call are deeply concerned about the mental fitness and the well-being of first responders across the state. And I just thought I would to set this up a little bit more, let's just talk a little bit in the aftermath or in this stage of grieving. Just want to check in with each of you in terms of where you are and what you feel like would be helpful for the people that have tuned into this. And Kyle, I'll just start with you. Where are you, and what do you think we should talk about?
Well, John, as you know, it was a heck of a week for me last week with everything that went on and having 3 losses to deal with myself, and going forward and trying to process 3 losses at one time, I think is a lot. And I don't think that we as first responders necessarily put ourselves in that mode. We kind of do the job and move forward and don't really process. And I think that we need to learn to do a better job of processing those losses and understanding that we can grieve as first responders and we should grieve as first responders. I think there's still a stigma behind it that we need to be those big, tough providers that show no emotion and don't grieve for our losses, but I think we need to.
Yeah, it sure isn't. Our natural tendency is to dust ourselves off and keep going. And right. I think at times we're at a loss to know how to grieve.
I think sometimes we just get so overwhelmed that we just will process when we have time to process. And when will that time come? Do we ever truly get that time to process, or do we just continue to stuff our thoughts and feelings down deep into our little boxes, and when we get to it someday down the road, 15, 20 years, when we finally burn out as providers, is that when we're finally going to process all that we've saw?
Yeah, thank you. So let's address that question. So I'm making kind of a list of questions, and we'll talk about them after I check in. PJ, where are you this morning, and what's your thoughts?
Well, today is a good day. The sun is shining and it's warm in North Dakota, even on the east side of the state. So that's where I'm at today. But I mean, just kind of echoing what Kyle says is, we all grieve differently, and you know, this past year has been tough for me and my family and even our service. And I think where I'm at in my process of grief is I'm just beginning it, even though my loss was in December. It's just starting for me now. And a thing to remember is that it can happen when and however it happens for you. It's different for everybody. And also just be aware of those feelings. And that's kind of where I'm at in my process as well. And where I've been is just when things kind of flood over me, or when I'm in a certain instance and I'm just aware of kind of those triggers or how I'm feeling when I'm in those situations. And I think that's like the first step, is to say, whoa, this feels different. This feels weird. And I acknowledge that and I accept it and I think about it. And that was happening for months and I didn't really know what was going on. And then all of a sudden it like hit me. And that's when my grief decided to start. And so that's kind of my one take back, is just I continuously am aware of how I'm feeling and what I'm doing when I'm feeling that, and who I'm with, and those types of things.
Yeah, so you bring up a really important point that when we don't allow ourselves to grieve, the loss still operates in the background. And we may be able to go on calls, we may be able to take care of our families, we may be able to pay bills, get up in the morning, make breakfast, do all the things that we need to do, but there's this thing operating in the background. And I'm guessing from what I've heard that both individually for us in North Dakota, these recent losses are operating at a level for all of us that'll probably be different, but they are still there. And so we'll talk a little bit about what do we do with this? How do we begin to even, I love that you said, I'm finally starting the process. So let's talk about what that process is and what processing looks like. Marcy, how are you today, and what's your thoughts?
Oh, I'm doing good right now. I am concerned about how many suicides, not only within the EMS, but also out in the public, and that you're hearing of more and more suicides. And it concerns me, that people are so overwhelmed that they are unable to see beyond what they're facing right now to uh, finding something in the far future, where that they feel like this is the only answer. And so, and I think, a lot of times it's also might not be the situation right now that may be causing it, but all the other things going on in our lives, all the different directions we're getting pulled in, um, and things like that. Uh, for the most part, I'm just sad because of, um, from hearing all the news that's out there. And I just kind of wonder, you know, it seems like that a lot of people really aren't interested in how to take care of themselves and learning about mental wellness. And how can we get that out there so that we can help people? Like what Kyle's shirt on the message is break the stigma. How can we get people to realize that, we're all human, we all go through these emotions, and how can we help, how can we help others, and how can they reach out and ask for help, get an interest in how we can take care of ourselves and take care of our mental wellness. I think that is really so important no matter what career we have, and especially within EMS here when we're dealing with these tragedies. And we see these horrible deaths, and we see there's a lot of things that we're involved with. And so how can we, encourage others to um, take care of themselves before the bad calls come, and take care of, the stresses, and work on our own mental wellness so that we can help ourselves get through this.
I'm so glad you asked that question. And what we'll do today is work with. We'll talk a little bit about grief, and let's talk a little bit about first responders as it relates to suicide in our organizations. And then let's talk about that question that you posed, which is, why do we see such a resistance on the front end to take better care of ourselves and for our organizations to do that? So here's what I have to say to our listeners. We likely will go well over our 30 minutes today. We're just going to give some space and time to this, and we understand that if you have to leave at 30 minutes, there is a recording of this, so there will be an opportunity for you to pick it up later. But if it's okay with my panelists here today, I think we'll just plan to go as long as we need to this morning and give this some space and time that it needs. Is that okay?
Yep.
Good. So the first thing I just wanted to talk about is in the midst of feeling loss, I'm guessing that people across North Dakota are feeling a mixture of things. And the mixture of things, loss hits us differently dependent upon our proximity to it. So when we lose someone who is in our daily lives, what we find is there is a powerful emptiness and vacuum that is left. And I'm going to talk in a minute about what that grief process is, but then also when there is someone in the first responder community who may not have been in our daily lives, in other words, we weren't spending time with them on a regular basis, but we hear about the loss, we may have known them or known of them, there is also this loss that we feel that won't augment our daily lives, but does create a cloud and a sense of wondering and mystery and concern, because one of the things that sure is common about first responders is we have kind of a sisterhood and a brotherhood where we care a lot about each other. And so when something touches one of us, it's as if it touches all of us. And so when we're dealing with grief, what we're dealing with is, and PJ, I'm really happy that you mentioned it as a process, and Kyle also did too. So there is something going on in the aftermath of a loss, and what we're really dealing with is our brains love the status quo, and part of what makes us human and helps us survive is that throughout our lives, from the very earliest days of our childhood, we are making bonds. We are making connections. And what it means to be human is to connect to things and mostly to connect to people. So we're always making those kinds of connections. And our brains like the status quo to stay in place. And now suddenly we're experiencing the absence or the loss of something that we're connected to, and it's taken away. And what we wind up feeling, what we wind up experiencing is both a need to work with the intellectual information of that and the emotional information of that. And here's what I mean. Intellectually, notice how when you hear of a loss, that you wind up continuing in your mind to say, oh yeah, this loss happened. And you'll wake up in the morning and you'll know something's amiss and you'll say, oh yeah, this loss. And what's happening is intellectually, you're beginning cognitively to process that loss. But here's the other part about that. The other part about that isn't so obvious is that we're also trying to process the emotional connections to all of that. And that's where the deep mix of feelings comes out. These feelings of sadness, sometimes anger, sometimes despair. All of these emotional feelings are there. And here's what the processing is. It often takes much longer for us to process the emotional side of this loss, because simply intellectually choosing to say, I know that this loss happened. All right, I'm integrating that information. Our emotional being doesn't catch up. So I'm curious, in your own experiences with loss, and some of you mentioned that we process this all different. Talk a little bit about how you process this for yourselves. What have you learned from watching other people's? What have you learned from previous losses? How do you work with loss in your own life? And Lynn, I'm going to turn to you. With your age and wisdom, what have you learned about loss?
Well, there have been different kinds of losses, but at the root, I think they all are very much alike. And one of the things that has bugged me a little bit, I guess, is that nobody else's world has stopped when it felt like mine has. Um, and I am guilty of the same way when others experience loss. I know I am, but that's a little hard to deal with sometimes. But I just wonder if at some point, John, I could ask a question about what both Kyle and PJ said, that the process, and that Kyle mentioned that this can take a long time. We can have, and you said that we can have these things kind of sitting in the background for a long time. And PJ said that there was a trigger moment where she realized the grief hit her 4 months after her loss. If we get to that point where PJ is now, can that process last months or maybe years even once we truly start?
So such a great question, and you meant first. I'm going to talk about time because you mentioned the time that it takes, and often this thing you said, it feels like I'm dealing with something and the world is going on. That's one of the first hallmarks that you are in the midst of grief work and you need to do the processing or work. So research has shown that what we do as humans over a period of time is when the loss happens, there's a ripping away. And then what happens, and it takes time, is that we begin to start integrating that loss. We never get over it. Ask any parent that's lost a child. You will never get over it, but what you will learn over time is that the grief work is you begin to rewrite the story of you and your world and how you live in your world now to accommodate this loss. And when we do the work, we learn to carry the loss in a way in which we can go on with our lives. That doesn't mean we forget the one we've lost. It doesn't mean that they disappear. What it does mean is that we have found a carrying. But what Lynn, you talk about feeling like everybody else is moving on and I'm kind of stuck here. That feeling of being stuck is that inside awareness that I have not built a way to carry this loss yet. And I'm still in the process of doing that. And we'll talk a few minutes about how that happens, how that works out. But one of the things that we can do with loss, and this happens with first responders all the time, is that we can experience a loss and integrate it intellectually, but not emotionally, and then simply delay the emotional integration of it. So a typical story that's often told is the story of a mother who has several children and loses one of those children, but she still has to take care of the other children. What she will often do is delay her grieving because life demands that she do what she has to do. And often it's sometime later when it's both safe and when there is time and space that she will then be able to allow herself to let down, feel the feelings, and begin to work through the emotional side of that grief. Doesn't mean that intellectually she doesn't know that she lost, but she will delay that. And so we can do that. We can do that indefinitely. We see many of our veterans come back from war, and because they were in an environment where they might have lost a buddy, they might have lost colleagues that they were in the service with, they still had to fight the war. They still had to do what their mission was. And so it's often when they come home and they feel they feel safe, and then they have the space and time that they start to deal with it. Now, what I want to say is that it's possible not to deal with it at all. And we know that we are steeped in what I call the John Wayne mentality. And the John Wayne mentality is that you accept the intellectual information of the loss, but you never do the emotional work of it, and you thrust your chest out and you keep going. And the challenge of that is that it operates in the background and then at various moments squirts out sideways. Anger, depression, a feeling of incompleteness. And so this whole deal of learning how to grieve is not something that we talk about very much, but it is so important for us to begin to normalize the conversation around this. Kyle, talk a little bit about your, if you would be so kind, what you're experiencing now, and also from your own experience with grief and loss, talk about how you are allowing or looking for being able to deal with the emotional side of all of this.
Oh, where to begin, huh? It's a roller coaster, right? You think you're doing well, and then you start doing something, or you start QAing a report, or start getting ready for an EMT class, and you come across that lecture, and all those feelers come right back to you, and that grief overwhelms you again, and you put yourself right back in that same situation. And so that roller coaster of emotions, I think right now I'm embracing it. After our conversation the other day, and people reaching out and talking to me, I think I'm starting to process those three events a little bit easier right now. Am I over it? No. Am I anywhere close to being able to process what happened? No. Will I ever be able to truly process some of that? Probably not, right? We'll never have those answers. We'll never know why. We'll never have that answer of what could I have done differently. And so I think that part of the grief is going to last probably my lifetime. Anytime I see a picture of my uncle or whatever it might be, I'm going to remember that this is how it happened. This is how it went down, and that grief is still going to come back, and those questions are still going to remain.
So you talk about the roller coaster, and let's just unpack that for our listeners for a minute. So when you talk about the roller coaster, what you're talking about is you find these waves of emotion where at certain times of the day you may feel semi-normal, but then something else comes along and there is a reminder, and you find yourself dipping down into sort of that wet, messy place. And you may not want to be there because you have to go teach a class or you have to do something else, but there you are, right?
Like right now, just talking about it, I feel myself in that. I feel those, lack of a better word, butterflies in my stomach. I can feel my voice starting to tremble. I can feel everything building up again because it's still very real and very near right now. I mean, it hasn't even been a week yet, or it is a week, I guess. Today is Thursday, so it's been 1 week exactly. And so those emotions are still very raw, and the process is still very much in the beginning. And you wake up in the morning and you do your morning routines. You get your kids ready, you get everything ready in the house, and you go to work. And as the day goes on and you start talking about stuff, and then it kind of pops back into your mind that, oh yeah, they're truly gone, and I'll never have that conversation again. I'll never get those gifts again, those Christmas gifts that were well played with and always had a fresh set of batteries and in a different box. So the whole process kind of takes a turn midday or towards the end of the day, and you're just like, oh yeah, that truly happened. So.
And so Lynn had asked about timelines on this. The literature and research and study of grief, there is no fixed timeline, but we certainly know from the experiences of other people and the charting of it that often this takes months and longer. Sometimes grief lasts well over. So when do you know? When do you know that that things are healing? Things are healing when the waves come less frequently. And the thing about humans is that to live is to experience loss. The only thing that will save us from experiencing loss is our own passing. But this thing of experiencing what Kyle is experiencing is one of the prime reminders of what it means to be human and to love and be loved and connect. So to be human means that we're going to make these connections, and we are going to experience losses. And so rather than treat the grief process as something not normal that we should get over, we need to treat it as very normal and allow ourselves to roll with it. And one of the ways to do that is to simply let people around you know that you're grieving. It's a very simple thing to say, I'm grieving. I'm still grieving. I feel like I should be over this. I'm still grieving. And when we say that out loud, not only are we informing others, but we're giving ourselves permission to do this. I know it's been 3 months. I'm still grieving. And in that way, and here's one of the things that we've talked about on these videos, is that one of the key elements of our mental fitness as first responders is we're so good at taking care of everybody else. We're so good at having an answer and going out and taking care of everybody else. And in fact, even in the midst of grief, we would welcome a big ass call so we can go out there and take care of somebody else. And do anything not to deal with this, what Kyle described as the butterflies in his stomach. We'll do anything not to do that. But here's what I want to encourage you is that we need to have the compassion for ourselves. It's really hard for us to have self-compassion, but to be compassionate enough to ourselves to say, I'm grieving. I'm grieving. And give ourselves a pass so that we can take a few minutes and have those waves. Allow ourselves to go down into that wet trough and experience it. Marcy, I know you have had experience with grief. Does this ring true? What are some of your thoughts?
Yes, it's very true. And when you go through that roller coaster, I just embrace it. When things come up that it reminds me of something, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I'm still grieving. It's okay. And allow yourself to feel it. And sometimes, like if I'm out like teaching something and I'm teaching at an EMT class or doing something, and all of a sudden, you know, this might trigger something in me. Sometimes just to even mention it, just to mention, you're talking about this bad trauma call and this is reminding you of one. And then just talk about that call, give a little bit of details about it and how you handled it. And even just to let the people that you're teaching know, hey, you're going to get these calls and you're going, and sometimes they don't have good turnouts. And it's just a way of being able to embrace it and to talk about it. But mostly it's just like, okay, yeah, I know I just experienced this. I'm sad. I embrace it. And, just letting yourself know that it's okay. And you don't have to sit and dwell on it for hours on end. Sometimes, things become so overwhelming. Sometimes it's like this big hole that you feel in your heart. And just be a kind of having awareness and giving yourself permission to grieve and to have that sadness. It really makes a big difference because instead of trying to push it away, because if you're going to push it away, it doesn't help you get through it. You don't process it. You got to go through it to be able to get it. You got to feel those feelings. And for a while, it's more intense. It's more sad. You might have more tears, but that's how it's helped me, just to acknowledge that it's, this is normal. There's nothing wrong with you. And I think we say that it's more about the situation is abnormal rather than your emotions being abnormal. And even just to say, hey, yeah, I'm human. This is what it's like to be human, is to have these feelings.
Yeah, you've said some really great things. This idea that grief is the normal response to an abnormal event.
Yes.
When I lose somebody close to me, there is this is not normal, but to grieve is normal. And you also mentioned something else when you talked about the EMT class and all of that. And I want to mention to people, so how do you help first responders grieve? Because most of us stuff it down, quickly want to move on. and go over. So let's talk about why the first responder funeral is often doesn't allow for a dry eye in the place. What we're doing when we do this is something that people have known for eons across all cultures, is that when you lose something, you somehow need to mourn it. Now the word mourn, M-O-U-R-N, mourn, to mourn something, what does that mean? Is that means that we take something that we're feeling inside and give it an outward expression. So when we line up tons of first responder vehicles and we recognize the person that we've lost, we simply being part of that mourning process gives us permission to feel our feelings. So what I want to say about mourning is that mourning is something that even beyond those kinds of formal services, we can give ourselves permission to do. We often, many of us have driven along the highway and seen a little shrine beside the highway of a cross and some candles and maybe somebody's name, where someone has built a little remembrance of their loved one who died in a traffic accident. This is a way of mourning. And when we take what's inside and we give it some sort of external expression, it helps us bring what is in out. And it's a way of affirming to us. So think about it this way: as an agency, if you've lost something, how can you collectively and symbolically as a group mourn that loss? After I talked to Kyle the other day, and I felt his loss was not my loss. I was not going to wake up in the morning because I did not have the loss, but I felt Kyle's loss and wanted to bring that in. And one of the things that I did that evening is we have a little altar in our house, and I lit a candle for him and for the first responders all across North Dakota. So as you're working with grief, continue to work at ways to bring what's in out by mourning rituals. That can be, maybe you place a picture in a special place. Maybe you create something. Maybe together, you as a group just get together and host a conversation. All of these are external ways, like Marcy talks about in the class, stopping to just give time to this. It's no accident that in battlefields, the soldiers will bring the helmet and the boots and the rifle and place it there symbolically, because when we take what's inward and give it external symbology or symbols, it helps us really begin to start working with that grief and giving ourselves permission to both feel it and express it. PJ, what do you want to add to this?
Well, in typical PJ fashion, I have like all these like notes that I've been writing. So I just got to understand what I wrote. Through the conversation, I think to myself, like, with the loss of my mom, I thought that I would live a life. I mean, I've lived half my life. I'm 40. How am I going to live the next 40 years without her? So I'm like, man, I think I might live a life of grief for the rest of my life. Like, I just had that fear, like, what do I do with that? And I've kind of in my brain started to tell myself, I'm not going to live a life of grief. I'm going to live a life of loss. Absolutely. I mean, of the loss of my mom, and what am I going to do with that, and how am I going to get through that? Because there's always going to be if she was only here, or she would love this, or all of that through my kids' life, through my life. And so we're just trying to, as a family, like you said, taking some of those inward emotions and feelings and putting them out. And so as a family, we're trying to do things that would honor her, whether that's making new traditions, like Mother's Day is coming up. We're like, what the heck are we going to do now? And so we're like, she loved crafts. We're going to do crafts every Mother's Day from now on. And that's like our outward expression to help us, feel that loss and get through that. And so I've been trying to figure that out because I'm kind of an analytical person that I need to like have an answer for things. And part of that, I'm also giving myself some grace and saying, you know what, you don't have to fix it. You don't have to have an answer. You just have to let it happen, which has been a struggle. And I think it is for most providers like us, is we want to fix it. That's our job, is to fix everything. So I'm learning that a little bit. And I really liked, talking about how, so there's that that intellectual, like, you have the loss, and then there's an emotional response as well to that. And thinking about that, this loss of my mother is the first really close family loss that I've had. Had lots in the field, and I feel like I have gone through that process and grieved those much differently than how I am with this really personal loss. So it's just like an affirmation that all grief is different. The process is different. I feel like with my mother, I emotionally went through it first. I shut my brain off and I cried and I emotionally went through it. Now I'm intellectually going through it. But when I've had loss like in the field, it's been the other way. So it's just interesting. I've never been in a place that I've thought about that. And it's just important to remember that it's okay, because to feel things differently than the next person. I've gone on many calls that were not good. And my partner has been, maybe a mess emotionally, intellectually, and I haven't been. And so then I'm like, what's wrong with me? Why don't I feel that? And knowing now, in retrospect, that's okay if we're different, because everything is different. And be there for them when they need it, because they're going to be there for you when you need it. And it might not be on the same call or the same type of call. It might not even be ambulance related. So I think just that conversation about the differences is really helpful, because nobody's normal. And so
Yeah,
grief definitely is it.
what we want to make normal is doing what we're doing right now. This is what we want to make normal, is allowing people to get together and freely and openly simply talk about this. We've erroneously believed that we get over grief when we no longer talk about it anymore. And instead, it's actually quite the opposite. So typically, when we teach grief, we talk about sort of 3 stages of the grief process. The first we kind of call the shock or the bombshell. You know what that's like? That's when you get the news all of a sudden. And that's a very chaotic period. And sometimes some of us are just ice cold stoic, and sometimes we freak out. You know that you've worked a cardiac arrest and gone into the kitchen to tell Mrs. Smith that her husband is dead. And you've seen that bombshell shock, right? So that first stage is and usually that lasts a few days to weeks, but that's the intellectual part. People usually get over that. But the second stage we usually often talk about in grief is what we call the wilderness period. And the wilderness period is, as you've integrated that intellectual information, what you want to do is move on, right? But the emotions won't let you. And you feel, it's interesting. I ran a grief program for men at a hospital many years ago. And when the men would come to this grief program, which was a support group for men, the first question they would have is they'd go, hell yes, I'm grieving. Yeah, I lost my wife, or I lost this person or that. And they would come, but their first question was, how do I get over this? And what they were looking for was the only reason they came to the grief support group was they were looking for a shortcut to get through it. So the wilderness period, there's no shortcut. That's going to be as long as it is. And in that wilderness period, we call it the wilderness period because you're going to feel kind of lost. Like, God, what's wrong with me? Why am I still having these waves and going down and feeling myself lethargic or feeling myself not with much energy? And that long period, the wilderness period, is when it's so important to connect with other people. Not only do we need to mourn during the grieving process, but we also need to connect with other people and tell the story. One of the most profound things that we have learned in working with veterans and in working with first responders around loss is as you tell the story. So PJ, you talked about Mother's Day coming up. And one of the things that you'll notice is as we open the door to mourning and allowing ourselves to grieve, we will find that we often say, hey, you remember when she used to come and do this? Do you remember this about it? And those stories are told, and then we'll often retell the story of the death. We'll say, yeah, I just couldn't believe it when I got that phone call. I couldn't, and all of that retelling the story, when we tell the story, is the way our brain is beginning to find a new holding and carrying for it. So if you will allow yourself to create safe spaces where you can be together and tell the stories, it's okay to come back and say, hey, I'm thinking about Jim, or hey, I'm thinking about this person, or I'm thinking about this loss, and allow yourself to do that. The more you do that, the more we tell the story, the more we begin to find a better carrying for the grief. Lynn, does that ring true for you?
Yes. Yes, it does. And as tough as sometimes the stories can be, it seems to me the more that we share those, the more joy there is in remembering instead of pain. So yeah, to have a safe space with people you can trust, I think has just been really important to me, and is needed. Yep.
Thanks, Lynn. Kyle, did you want to add anything to that?
Oh, I think you guys all pretty much summed it up perfectly there. And it's finding those people that you can trust, that you can open up to, and have those honest heart-to-heart conversations with, that really help you through this process. The ones that, you might have that ugly cry on, and they're not going to judge you for it. They're going to be sitting there right beside you and letting you just have that ugly cry, and not telling you to get over it, and not telling you that what you're feeling is wrong, or how to get through that process. Just being there for you is some of the best friends that you can have.
It's so true. And when we were talking the other day about this, but when we're with people who are grieving, one of the most important things to do is to simply follow their lead and give no advice. So if they say, God, why did this happen? I mean, So young. Why did this happen? They're not asking you to answer that question. Well, we wind up being the best comforters to others when we simply follow their lead. If they're angry, say, yeah, this is horrible. If they're sad, cry with them or sit with them. But don't lecture. They don't need advice on what to do, and you are not going to tell them how to get over it quicker. And most of all, don't try to explain the divine purpose in this. Let them have their relationship with their God and find the comfort in their faith, but don't be an interpreter of that. It's a great way to stall somebody in their grief process is to interject some sort of why that's not theirs. And the most comfort you can be to people is to be with them and allow them an opportunity. And here's what I do with stoic guys that are thick-skinned and won't open up. I simply ask them not about the loss itself, but about the person that they've lost. Tell me a little bit about Jim, or tell me a little bit about Mary. When did you first meet her? Or what was that? That's the only questions that I ask, because when they will simply can talk about, they may not be able to even get close to the loss as in terms of talking about it, but if they can talk about the person, it's a way of allowing them to interact with something that's very difficult for them. And the kindness that you give by letting them grieve in their own way will be deeply appreciated. Marcy, did you want to add anything to this discussion about grief?
Well, one of the things that I had thought of is sometimes guilt falls in there with it. I should have noticed that something was going on, or you're on a call and maybe if I would have done this, maybe the outcome would have been different. Feeling that guilt that can sometimes, twist that grief a little bit and make it, a little bit with that. And so, and that's, that's a normal process. Sometimes we might think that, but not to dwell on it. And, with that as well, you got to process through that as well.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. And in the process, it is very normal for guilt to come through in many, many ways, and especially when we're dealing with suicide. It can be very easy for a sense of guilt to show up. And one of the things that we say, so guilt shows up as a feeling, right? It's something that we feel. So one of the things that is really, really important about emotions is we tend to try to put boxes around negative emotions, whether that's guilt, shame, anything else. We try to put a box around it because we don't like it, or we try to find an explanation for it. What I want to say is really important is during the grieving process, for the process to move along, is to simply welcome all emotions as they are. Wow, I hear you're feeling guilty. Tell me more about that, if you're willing. Without trying to assuage the guilt or take it away. One of the things that we learn about people is when you try to rob them of their feelings. If I'm feeling really angry and you try to take away my anger, that either will shut me down or cut me off from you. What will welcome me is if you have a big enough heart to hold those emotions. I hear you're feeling guilty. Just allow whatever the feelings are there to be there. As the way beyond is through. The vast majority of losses we eventually carry and find a way to go on. But the best carrying of that loss as we move on comes when we allow ourselves to go through all that's there. And let's just briefly talk when help is needed. We know that help is needed when we find ourselves over a period of time not being able to function, not being able to process, when we find repetitive thoughts just circling around our minds to such a degree that they begin to impede our ability to do the things we need to do, take care of ourselves. When we find ourselves, sometimes we find ourselves kind of closed in by a sense of hopelessness. All of that is a signal that you might benefit from reaching out to some professional help. And what we need to normalize as first responders is we need to normalize the check-in, and the check-in with each other, and the check-in with being able to access help that's out there. There are many, many amazing therapists who are really, really sharp, and some of the best well-adjusted first responder leaders that I know across the United States have all at times used therapy to help them through something. There is nothing to be ashamed of about that. We live in a time where we're learning more and more about how to do that really well. And if you are in law enforcement and you are afraid that this might tarnish your credibility, there are ways to get help without it ever having to be known, but don't suffer alone. It's just what I want to say. If you're feeling stuck and you can't get out of this, what you need more than anything else is simply to do a check-in. Hey, I'm kind of feeling like I'm stuck in this grief process. I want to check in with somebody. Am I on track, or is this something that needs extra care and help with? What about this? Anybody have any comments about that?
I guess the therapy thing is interesting because many of us feel like maybe we don't have time for it, or like you said, it's makes us weak and it's going to be uncomfortable and all of that. And the truth is, it's like, just from I just wanted to share a little of my experience is when you find the right, therapist, it is one of the most like cathartic experiences, even if they don't say a word back to you, but you're able to kind of just vomit out your feelings and your words in a safe environment without being judged by anyone you know. Um, I have done it now, a few times through my grief process, and right away I was told that, I'm here to let you talk and listen, and I just want to have you to check, or I want to be here for you to check in, like just like you said. And I know that on the other end, like they're just kind of observing like where my thoughts and my feelings are. And there isn't a lot of like conversation that actually happens. It's a lot of me just spewing my guts, and it feels really good. It really actually kind of sucks when you're there because you're crying and you're a mess and it's, this whole emotional tornado. But when I walk out and I drive home, it is a feeling of like a little bit of freedom. You can now like take a deep breath. It's easier to breathe. It just helps you kind of get that junk out without like having to like explain yourself, or I don't know. It's a good experience, and I just don't want people to be frightened of it. Um, and not saying that, I mean, is it gonna work? You know, like sometimes you're like, I'm not gonna go because it's not gonna work. Well, what are you expecting to get out of it? Like my expectation is that I'm just gonna go into a room, shut a door with a person, and I'm gonna cry. I'm probably gonna swear. I'm gonna tell them how unfair I think the world is. And that's all my expectation was. Like I don't expect to go in there to be like healed or fixed, you know? So I just wanted to share a little bit of that experience, and don't be frightened. Um, it's quite fun, actually.
Perfect. Good.
I
Any other
agree with,
Go,
yeah,
Lynn.
John, I agree with PJ. There was a really, really tough time in my life, and found a good therapist and was there for, visited several months, and what a great help it was. Um, as the older I get, the more emotional I get, and the less I care about what people think about that. And it would have been helpful if I could have had that attitude years ago. But yeah, therapy was really helpful. I'm glad I went.
It's yeah, I would encourage if anybody thinks this is for weaklings, I'm happy to introduce you to Navy SEALs and other people who definitely have punched their man card 3 or 4 times over, who will tell you that one of the best experiences of their lives was, as PJ say, to get in a room where somebody's paid to be a verbal garbage basket for them to get some stuff off. And it's pretty amazing what you can do once you allow yourself to speak freely about what is genuinely going on in your heart. Well, I just wanted to mention, we've been on a while, and I just wanted to mention, we had talked a little bit about where we as first responders, in the aftermath of working with suicide, we know all across the United States, first responder suicide is a topic that is garnering lots of attention, and we could take a whole webinar to spend a lot of time talking about this. And we a few years ago we did some I had a project in North Dakota where we did some suicide training. We might want to resurrect that. That program material is still all out there. But what I want to suggest is that what we're experiencing in the aftermath of losses is an opening. And when this is very tangible to the first responders in North Dakota right now. And the tangibility part of this is creating an opportunity for us to do what is most important in suicide prevention, which is to normalize the conversation about how we're doing as human beings. And what we want to do is create in our environments and in our agencies and in our colleague circles an opportunity to regularly check in on how one another is doing. And what we know is that talking about suicide does not increase its likelihood. It's actually the opposite. And when we as a group make it normal to be able to ask each other questions, how are you doing? How are you feeling? What are you thinking? What are you planning? All of these things are vitally important to creating an environment where people feel normal and simply saying, I'm feeling really hopeless. And so without going into a lot of detail, what I just want to suggest for people listening is that we use this opening not to necessarily go have a workshop or anything else, but to make it more normal within your agency to regularly check in. Before a training meeting, it's very easy to simply say, yeah, before we get to talking about our airway management class tonight, let's just do a quick check-in. How are you doing? We want to look out for each other here in our agency. We want to create a buddy system. We really want to do this. How are we doing? And what you're doing each time you do that is you're beginning to create a safe space for people to bring what they're feeling and feel more like they can talk about it. One of the most preventative things we can do is continue to build relationships with one another to the degree that there is trust so that somebody can say, I'm hurting, I'm lost, I'm dark. And someone else can say, hey, you look like you're hurting, you're lost, you're feeling dark. So if we can create that kind of environment out of it, our chances of really helping one another in this very, very difficult, um, really a public health issue that we're experiencing. Anybody have any comments about that? Well, the last thing we were just going to talk about is I wanted to address Marcy's question about why first responders are so often resistant to talking about mental fitness, to doing preventative things to take care of themselves and their emotional well-being. And that's kind of the whole purpose of all of these webinars is to bring more of that out and do that. But I'll turn it back to you. Marcy, what's your thoughts? Why do you think we are so resistant to the help?
Well, I think it's the stigma yet that's still out there. You got to be tough. You don't want to show that you're weak. That has some of it to do with some of it, I think. Um, or they don't think it's necessarily about them. Or they might just think it's all about, I mean, even though exercise and staying fit happens, or having a healthy lifestyle is a part of it, but it's not just that. I think, we need to make it more a norm. Like even when we're teaching our EMTs and, going from when you start teaching EMTs to start talking about how you're going to take care of yourself to be able to handle these tough calls, how to deal with what's going on with your life, plus with EMS. I think we need to, instead of just talking about getting your vaccines and, wearing your gloves and staying safe, those ways, we need to implement within, make it normal as a part of, like you said, part of your meetings. Start talking about it. Start, how we take care of ourselves to be mentally fit. And do it before the bad calls come.
I mean, I think you nailed it. We have a culture that has prized sacrifice and even martyrdom at times for the cause, right? We
Yeah.
beg people to pick up extra shifts. We beg them to burn the candle at both ends. And then we pat everybody on the back and we reward this. So we've created an environment that is really antithetical to an environment of self-care and taking care of yourselves. And so one of the things that we hope people begin to get from this work, the fine work that your guys are doing and this committee, is to begin to look at your agency and ask yourselves, in what ways are we contributing to people not taking care of themselves? In what ways are we contributing to people not taking care of themselves? And ask yourselves, because the only way we'll change is if we bring more awareness all throughout the organization, not just a few people, but really starting to say, if I'm going to be a first responder and I know that I'm going to have to go on those difficult calls and I'm going to have to take care of people in crisis and I'm going to have to deal with death, how is it that we're going to create the mental fitness needed to do that? Lynn, do you want to add anything to that?
I don't know if I can, John. Marcy said a lot. You have too. But I agree with you that the culture needs to change. And I think especially for males, I don't want to minimize grief for anybody, but there seems to be maybe just our generation, John, when it seemed like we were kind of taught to be very stoic, no emotion, that was a weakness, and it's a shame that it takes such a kick in the groin sometimes to get a teardrop out of a guy, and so I'd like to see that change. Yeah, but no, you guys have really nailed it.
PJ, anything to add before we wrap up?
I don't think so, because like Lynn said, you guys did a great job explaining that. I mean, to me, it's gotten to a place where I can be vulnerable in front of all of my crews. And once I was able to kind of unlock that vulnerability door, it was amazing how many other people did too. And it just took, me saying, this is what's going on and this is what I feel like. And people were like, oh my gosh, I feel like this. And it just like flooded open. And so I think people genuinely want to have a conversation about how they're feeling. It's just maybe they don't know how to start it. And so if you're one of those people that is lucky enough to say, you know what, I'll be vulnerable today, do it. I encourage you to do it, because it's surprising what kind of will flood in after you make that initial leap.
I think that that's just a wonderful place to end, is just to encourage people that we're all still here supporting each other, and if we begin to start creating an environment in our agencies where talking about all of these things, from grief to suicide to self-care to all of this, can be a way to have a better first responder experience. And I know my passion in this work is, I think that being an EMT, medic, firefighter, cop is one of the best callings in the world. And that the ultimate outcome of this should be a full and satisfying life in which, as we get older, we become better at knowing ourselves, we become better at handling grief, we become better at connecting with other people. And all of that is an opportunity that this work provides. Each day we get a chance to go out and see people in extremis and provide hope for them, and then connect with wonderful colleagues. So this is an opportunity, and what I just want to encourage people is, in the midst of these losses and feelings of sorrow, don't despair. Let us leverage what we're experiencing now into creating better agencies, being better persons ourselves, so that those who have gone on beyond us, we can do something that will bring a better place for our whole first responder community in the future. And I know if any of this brought some ideas or thoughts, all of us working with the committee, the association committee, will welcome your feedback and questions that you have or ideas for what we could do would sure be appreciated. So thank you everybody for hanging out with us, and we look forward to talking with you on the next one. Thanks, Marcy and Lynn, PJ.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you guys. Have a great day.
Thank you, you
Bye.
too.